Equatorial Guinea is a peculiar little place with a peculiar little history. It is split into two very distinct regions, the island of Fernando Po, now called Bioko, and this area of mainland Africa called Rio Muni. These two regions are divided culturally and economically as much as they are geographically. The island is primarily inhabited by the Bubi people, as well as a large lingering Spanish Creole population, and not only contains the capital of the modern state, but was historically the far wealthier of the two regions, due in part to its very fertile volcanic soil. Rio Muni is the home to the Fang, and despite containing 3/4 of the modern country's population, and the Fang being a supermajority in the country as a result, it is significantly poorer. There are also about a dozen other small islands dotted around the region, but they aren't really super important. If you think this causes issues with regionalism and ethnic conflict, then you would be correct. And who can we blame for this state of affairs? It's Europe. It's always fucking Europe. The first Europeans to show up were Portuguese, with the explorer, Fernando Po, stumbling upon the Big Island in 1472, which would eventually come to bear his name. The Portuguese figured out the fertile soil thing pretty quick, and 2 years later, a permanent colony would be established on the island, which over the next century would be augmented by plantations and port facilities. This naturally brought with it slavery and outright conflict with the Bubi people, which meant that the Portuguese didn't get a super big foothold over the island, instead maintaining it as essentially a resupply base. In 1778, the island and its surrounding ones were ceded to Spain in a treaty for some shit in Brazil. However, the Spanish would struggle as well. The guys sent to take possession of the island caught a disease and literally all died, and as a result, the Spanish didn't put too much investment into it. It essentially became a slave trading port and not much else. Because Spain has this glorious and profitable empire in the Americas that needs their attention. Surely nothing bad will happen to it. Well, that's unfortunate. Oh well, at least we still have this little tiny island. The port was leased to the British in 1827 after Spain had their slavery abolished at gunpoint, and it lost what little economic value it had, with the island being returned to Spanish control in 1844. The Spanish government had made plans to sell the island off, but the public had actually grown rather fond of this silly little rock, so they got upset and this plan was cancelled. Now stuck with it by popular decree, it was given its own administration and very, very gradually experienced colonization. I say gradually because the white settlers kept dying of diseases, and the Spanish government really just didn't give a shit. The island became something of a melting pot, with Spaniards, Englishmen, Creole peoples from other colonies, Africans from around the region, and the Bubi people all doing their thing. And as the 1900s drew closer, conditions improved and the agricultural sector started ramping up. Also, remember that treaty? Well, it also saw Spain claim this rough region of continental Africa, and more specifically, control over what became Rio Muni. This amounted to precisely nothing because the settlers the Spanish sent, once again, all died, and the Spanish claim went effectively unenforced. This is relevant because in 1885, at the Berlin Conference, Spain was able to claim this land. And they did, but not with any urgency until they nearly went to war with France over it, resulting in a treaty in 1900 that set the border here, which was way smaller than the Spanish claim and was so humiliating that the lead negotiator fucking killed himself after signing it. However, 2 years prior, in 1898, the Maine was blamed on Spain, and the United States yoinked what was left of the Spanish Empire. So suddenly, Fernando Po and Rio Muni were most of the Spanish Empire. Naturally, this meant that both the people and government became kind of attached to the place and started to actually give a shit. And in an attempt to claw some imperial legitimacy out of the absolute disaster that was the 1800s for Spain, they actually started investing into the colony. Development kicked into high gear in the early 1900s, but conditions for the native populations remained pretty shit because, colonialism. In 1904, a new law system was introduced that effectively unpersoned the native population, stripping them of all of their economic freedom and most of the legal rights they had. Land regulations were also enforced that heavily favored Spanish settlers and locked natives out of owning the most productive lands, and many of the island's non-Spanish people were forcibly conscripted into working on the plantations in hot conditions for no pay, as the labor was a payment in kind against their taxes, which were obviously rather crushing. However, when the native population got too low to support the number of plantations that were built, the Spanish began importing large amounts of cheaper and even more exploited labor from Liberia and Nigeria, which further weakened the position of the native populations. The Nigerian contract laborers would become the backbone of the island's economy for many decades, and tens of thousands of them would come to call the island their seasonal home. However, despite the regular colonial bullshit, the Bubi gradually began to advance. The Spanish system considered the natives to be wards of the state, and as such, the state and the Catholic missions were required to educate them and give them at least some land to work for themselves. The Bubi would become far more pro-Spanish than the Fang because of this. By the 1930s, an educated and and landowning Bubi class would be gradually solidified, accounting for a large part of the island's prosperity. The same could not be said for the Fang. Control over Rio Muni was solidified only gradually, with logging and plantation enterprises popping up very slowly. Traditional Fang ways of life were uprooted with the establishment of these enterprises, and this left the Fang in a decidedly worse position than the Bubi, despite the Fang having nearly quadruple the people by the 1920s, which created ethnic resentment and regionalism. As a further consequence, Fang religious and revivalist movements were commonplace, creating headaches for the Spanish, many of these movements being suppressed with extreme violence. This was immediately worsened in 1926, as the two separate colonies were united under a single administration in order to better streamline things and allow for the wealthier Fernando Po to help out the less wealthy Rio Muni. Now, the Bubi and Fang were tied together, and had to share the realm with the Creoles, who themselves became a strong middle class, as well as the myriad of Europeans that showed up. Now, we've seen this kind of setup many times, but believe it or not, these divisions would not be the future country's biggest problem. 2 years prior to the joining of the colonies, a child would be born in the Rio Muni region. Nobody knew it yet, but he would be the one to bring damnation. The man who would come to be known as Francisco Macias Nguema was born on January 1st of 1924. His early life is, shall we say, a bit all over the place from what I've read. Firstly, he may have actually been born in 1920 since there are no official records of his birth. According to some, he was born in Oyam, a town in Gabon, but was raised in Mongomo just over the border of the Spanish-controlled regions after his family was expelled because his father was a practitioner of witchcraft. Other places say he was just born in Mongomo, his father simply being a local noble, and leave it at that. We're gonna go with the first one because being expelled for witchcraft is objectively cooler. He was born Fang, birth name Macías Nguema, which he later Hispanicized to better fit with the administration of the colonizers, and he had upwards of 10 fucking siblings. I say this because, in the witchcraft version of the story, his father fucking sacrificed one of them. Not a lot is known about his childhood, save for a few key details. He was a rather sickly fella, suffering repeated bouts of tuberculosis, and as such, he did not become one built for intensive physical labor or activity. He was baptized into the Catholic Church fairly early in his life, and he received at least a primary school education through the church in the colony, learning Spanish in the process. He would go on to spend a large portion of his early life working as a servant in the household of a family of Spanish settlers. Macias went through his teenage years lacking proper socialization or education, which would make his life difficult. Regardless, he tried his best, but his best wasn't great. By all accounts, he was a terrible student with no real mind for study. He would take the civil service exams 4 separate times in the early 1940s, only finally succeeding in 1944 after some intervention from Spanish authorities. Despite his childhood, Macias was pretty happy to work with the Spanish, and he didn't hate them like many of the Fang did. So colonial authorities figured he would be a useful idiot and a model subject. And such subjects were desperately needed. In the late 1920s, the Spanish had started sending troops to Rio Muni to finally crush Fang descent, which pissed them off even more, and as the 1930s rolled on, Spain itself destabilized with alarming speed, which risked further agitation in the colonies. They were getting desperate, so they let him in, donning the uniform of a minor functionary and finding employment with the forestry and public works services, as well as spending time as a court interpreter. In any other timeline, he would have died in complete obscurity, but this is not any other timeline. In the run-up to the Spanish Civil War, a socialist organization was established amongst the Spaniards that supported the Republicans, which included the Governor-General of Rio Muni, and as a result, the mainland colony was actually the scene of some very brief fighting after the Civil War began, and Francisco Franco sent some troops down to take the colony over. Fernando Po supported the Nationalists, which only drove a further wedge between the two provinces. After the Nationalists won the Civil War, they were actually quite interested in maintaining the vestiges of Spain's former power, and they doubled down on the crackdowns on the indigenous people of the colony, primarily the Fang, while empowering the white settlers and the collaborationist Creoles. Fernando Po essentially became Spain's overseas jewel, with plantation owners and investors making a shitload of money off the backs of labor imported from British colonies, within the corporatist framework established by Franco that gave massive benefits to businesses while crushing the labor that they employed. But this meant that Spain made a lot of money, so they didn't care. However, the Bubi people, by now well educated in landowning, made up a large portion of the agricultural output, and they benefited from privileged access to Spanish markets, so despite the exploitation, Fernando Po was remarkably stable and loyal to to Madrid. The state of affairs continued almost uninterrupted until 1959. That year, based on the understanding that decolonization had become an inevitability, Fernando Po and Rio Muni were transformed into essentially provinces of Spain proper, in an attempt to pull as much money from the colony as possible before they inevitably had to let them go. These reforms also came with a few other things, including the establishment of civilian colonial administrators for the first time. Prior, they were drawn exclusively from the military, and everyone in the colony was raised to citizenship regardless of origin as a byproduct of the provincialization thing. They were also given some seats in the Spanish Parliament, which came with actual elections in 1960. This was followed by a jump in spending on the colony, causing a jump in GDP per capita and literacy rate. The intent was to present Spain as a benevolent overlord that was committed to the well-being of its colonial subjects, and hopefully stave off the United States, which was starting to hold the Spanish colonies over the government's head, while gearing the country up for eventual independence. Then, in 1963, Equatorial Guinea was given local autonomy, and bans on political parties and organizations were lifted for the first time in their history. It was a brave new world for those with the wherewithal to seize it. In the meantime, Macias was already showing signs of his eccentricities. As early as the 1940s, he was already taking bribes to fuck with translations to secure more lenient punishments as part of his court interpreter position, and he effectively became the singular link between the Fang people and the Spanish, giving him a lot of influence. For a price. At no point did he make any moves against his Spanish masters, and he took bribes from them too, and as such they came to see him as a reliable, if a bit peculiar, civil servant. This in turn gave him a reputation as a collaborator, and this proved to be very beneficial, as the Spanish were desperate for Fang of noble descent to like them to defuse the nationalist situation in Rio Muni. He used his accumulated wealth to establish his own coffee plantation, and he would become a legitimately prosperous fellow by the mid-1950s. Going into 1960, Macias was suddenly a person of major interest, and his career would begin to accelerate rapidly. The lifting of the bans allowed political organizations, previously underground, a chance to come out of the woodwork. The first and largest was the National Movement for the Liberation of Equatorial Guinea, or Monalige, which was founded in some form in 1950 but transformed into Monalige in the late 1950s by Acacio Mane Ela and Atanasio Ndongo Mion. They were a broad nationalist and leftist party and found support primarily amongst the middle and upper classes of the native populations, but their broad appeal was curtailed by aggressive persecution from Spanish authorities. Ela would be assassinated by the Spanish in 1959, and the party would be forced into exile in Gabon. The other big one was the popular idea of Equatorial Guinea, or IPGE, founded in 1959. These guys were explicitly left-wing nationalists and neo-Marxists, influenced by Nkrumah up in Ghana, and were also heavily persecuted. These groups were dominated by the Fang, as the Bubi on Fernando Po were far more willing to collaborate with Spain, and they all suffered from acute factionalism. But once they were unbanned in 1963 and the formal persecution stopped, they both began to attract sizable support bases in opposition to the National Unity Movement of Equatorial Guinea, or MUNJ. MUNJ was established in 1963 as a party that supported gradual independence, which would win that year's elections to rule the now autonomous colony under the leadership of Bonifacio Ondo Idu. Of course, because of their relations to the Spanish, MUNJ became deeply corrupt, but for now it served as a rallying point for the people. Now, admittedly, the Spanish did better than most other European countries when it came to setting up their colony for independence. In 1965, GDP per capita was the highest in Equatorial Africa, the country had a literacy rate of 89%, and the Spanish had constructed an international airport, a television station, and 16 fully functioning hospitals. The country had a well-maintained road system, the strongest export economy in the region, and the fourth highest electricity consumption in sub-Saharan Africa. The country would be in a very good spot when independence did come, but despite their best efforts of pulling off some sort of French Guiana situation, the UN started getting on Spain's case. Finally, in 1967, Spain threw up its hands. They convened a constitutional conference in October, inviting representatives from all over the colony, but it immediately deadlocked. The Bubi and Fang genuinely did not like each other. The only thing they agreed on was that the proposed state of Equatorial Guinea was a wholly artificial creation of European colonialism. A separate Bubi nationalist party, the Union Bubi, had even popped up by this point, which saw the more numerous and less economically prosperous Fang as a direct threat to their governance should a union be established. They began advocating for two separate independent states, with Fernando Po and the Bubi going it alone. The Fang, meanwhile, felt similar, not wanting the economically powerful Bubi to completely dominate all aspects of Fang life like the Spanish had done. But amongst the Fang, there were a sizable pro-union crowd, figuring that Rio Muni did not have the economy to function on its own. The primary supporters of a union of the two provinces were the formerly exiled leaders of Monalige and the IPGE, as well as the folks from MUNJ, but even these groups disliked each other. The IPGE was distrusted for being Marxist, and they disliked everyone else for being being not Marxist, and it was just chaos. As a result, this conference was just a shit show. However, of note was the leading speaker on behalf of the Fang, who ended up being none other than Francisco Macias. But how did he get here? Since the Spanish saw him as a useful idiot to gain favor with the Fang, Macias' career had rocketed upwards very quickly. In 1963, as a part of the establishment of the new autonomous government, he was promoted to the position of mayor of Mongomo, which came with a free seat in the Legislative Assembly, and was immediately brought into the Munj government as Minister of Public Works, since he did technically have experience in that area. Then, in 1964, he was jumped straight to the position of Deputy Prime Minister of Edo, once again largely thanks to the Spanish boosting his chances. He was a member of both the IPGE and Monalege in the past, and he was theoretically a Marxist. I say theoretically because, well, you'll see. But he was never once arrested for political activities, which I think tells you all you need to know. He would also make an impression on one Antonio Garcia Trevellano, a lawyer and Spanish opposition figure who was opportunistic to the core and believed that Macias had the ability to accomplish some things, and so the two struck up a partnership, with Trevellano acting as an economic advisor. Because neocolonialism is a bitch, Spain had every intention to retain control over even an independent Equatorial Guinea. The economy was still to be run by a minority with ties to Spain, they would retain a permanent ambassador that had limited say in government affairs, and they continued to run a constabulary in the country that would remain in place for a couple of years. The thought from the Spanish government was that Macias would be someone they could control, and exploit the country through him by proxy. In this sense, they are as guilty for the atrocities that would follow as he is. Macias was a creation at the end of the day. Anyways, at this conference, Macias got to put his political skills to use. He gave a big and boisterous speech where he praised Adolf Hitler and declared that the real plan of the Nazis was to liberate the African people from the chains of colonialism. Hold up, I beg your finest pardon, he said fucking what? He called himself a Hitlerian Marxist? Okay, here it is. Everybody declared war on Africa, and I wish to say one thing. I consider Hitler to be the savior of Africa. Hitler made mistakes because he was human. Hitler's intention was to end colonialism throughout the world. Although it is said that he persecuted the Jews, what he wanted was to combat colonialism, but he got confused. And then he wanted to command all the peoples of Europe, and so the peoples of Europe and America united and attacked Germany and destroyed her. What the entire fuck? This is an actual quote, by the way. I'm not making this up for dramatic effect. And this was completely unprompted. He just stood up and started talking and dropped this absolute banger. It might not surprise you to know that Macias was deeply mentally unwell, and even he knew this about himself. He visited several mental facilities and doctors while in Spain for this conference, and he had some kind of mental illness that remains unknown due to medical malpractice laws. It can be assumed it was some combination of delusion, insanity, schizophrenia, and a host of other things, because this Hitler incident is just the beginning. A mere taste, and amuse-bouche, if you will, of the things this man will do. And other aspects of his personality all but ensured it would only get worse. You see, Macias had developed a deep inferiority complex during his time in political office. He knew his lack of education and his status as a Fang made him a pariah amongst the equal parts intelligent and corrupt upper circles of the colony. He knew the Spanish only saw him as an idiot, and he hated it. He knew everyone looked down on him, and he hated it. This bubbled into a general distrust and eventual hatred of anyone he saw as more intelligent or refined than him, and a deep disrespect for anyone he saw as lesser. Nobody knew it yet, but this bitterness would combine with his completely untreated mental illnesses to bloom into something horrible. After 2 weeks of nothing getting done, the convention was suspended, during which Macias took a trip to the United Nations in New York, in an attempt to attain the appearance of an independence fighter back home. In April of 1968, Spain started the conference back up again, as international pressure was mounting, but this time the Hitlerian Marxist was much more prepared. With the help of Trevellano, a clique called the Joint Secretariat was formed with Macias at the center, composed of disgruntled members of the IPGE, Monalege, and Munj, which would serve as a basis point for attacks on people perceived as rivals. By now, Macias had been emboldened by the flame of ambition, and he figured that if he could maintain some support from the Spanish government and build a coalition around himself as a charismatic figurehead, then he could take power. As such, when the Spanish put their foot down and essentially shoved through a constitution that the delegates were forced to accept, Macias stood to benefit greatly. exactly. This constitution was modeled after fascist Spain's own, and had a very powerful head of state presidential system that could be easily exploited by opportunistic madmen. But otherwise, it was a very modern constitution with universal suffrage, a bicameral parliament, and protections for civil liberties. It also greatly benefited Fernando Po as a method of calming the separatist issue, but also ironically carried basically no provisions for protecting the rights of the Bubi as a minority group. The constitution was put before the people in August of 1968, returning a 64% vote in favor of its adoption. As a result, Equatorial Guinea was now on the path to independence. All that needed to be decided now was leadership. In the run-up to the September 1968 election, Macias decided to use his newfound influence to run for president. Why he chose to do this is unknown. I suppose it's the natural course for someone who's been in the realm of the political his whole life, but it is also equally likely that it was a Jojo Rabbit situation and Hitler was in his head telling him to kill all the people he didn't like. His homeboy Treviano threw 50 million pesetas behind his campaign, and helped out with writing his speeches and devising much of his strategy. He ran against Ndongo Millon from Monalige and his former boss Ondo Idu from Munj, as well as the Union Bubi. Macias's campaign was very successful. He appealed to tradition and nationalism and emphasized a very anti-Spanish slant, going as far as to promise that once he was in power, the Spanish would all fuck off and he would seize their stuff and distribute it to his voters. He also made use of television to broadcast his vision, presenting himself as a skilled politician that had what it took to make the country better. In response to this, the Spanish actually threw in behind Idu because he was a known quantity and very publicly willing to be Spain's bottom bitch, but this backfired because the Fang were very anti-Spanish and Idu was spectacularly corrupt by this point. When the election rolled around on September 22nd, Macias finished first, but did not secure a majority, leading to a runoff election where Idu, in his hubris, doomed his country to a decade of utter devastation on complete accident. Not wanting to potentially share power and thinking he could win the election on his own, he rejected the support of Monalige and the Union Bubi, who both promptly threw their support behind Macias, hoping to get some political privileges out of it. On September 29th, Macias won a decisive victory over Idu in an election that was genuinely free and fair. A few things to note about this victory, though. He had almost no support amongst the educated elite of the country, and he did not win his own home of Mongomo. I wonder if this will have consequences. Anyways, after his victory, Macias's immediate political actions were remarkably normal. For now. His ministerial appointments were rather broad politically, but were concentrated on those who had supported him as you would expect. Of note was Edmundo Bossio, a major Bubi figure, being named his vice president. Then, on October 12th, he oversaw the formal declaration of independence of Equatorial Guinea, and control of the land was formally handed over to Macias by the Spanish. The country was free to chart its own course in the world. Surely, nothing bad will happen. Well, the ink on the documents had barely dried before Macias showed his true colors. Madness and jealousy poisoning his mind, he began rapidly consolidating his power the good old-fashioned way. Idu fled to Gabon after losing the election, figuring that his life was in danger. Of course, Macias was a graceful leader, and he assured Gabon that he had no beef with the guy. And as such, Gabon, under massive pressure from Spain, extradited him in early 1969. Within hours, Idu had been savagely beaten and tossed in Black Beach Prison, a location that will become synonymous with Macias's reign of terror. The governor of Rio Muni and two of Idu's allies in the government that Macias had appointed mere weeks prior were also rounded up. Official government reports decree that Idu committed suicide on March 5th. In reality, he was tortured and starved for 10 days before being executed. The other three suffered similar fates, and Idu's wife would be arrested and murdered later that year. With his main rival out of the picture, Macias, who by this point was a #1 Spain hater, made it his primary objective to remove Spain's lingering influence. In early 1969, he made a series of radical anti-Spanish speeches. On February 23rd, after the Spanish ambassador refused an order from Macias to fly Spanish flags on the same level as other ambassadorial flags, i.e. lower, several flags would be torn down and burned by members of the National Guard, the newly established military police of Equatorial Guinea. The Interior Minister then declared that Spanish citizens in the country were not safe, and all hell broke loose. Franco straight up sent paratroopers to occupy the country's two airports to safeguard Spanish citizens, and hundreds of Westerners would flee the country. Ndongo Millon, who had been made foreign minister, did his best to negotiate and got the Spanish to agree to leave the country once their citizens had evacuated. But Macias was tirading on the radio and telling his citizens to kill them, so it was still kinda tense. However, it turned out that all of this bluster and chaos was simply a prelude to the Madman's Gambit. On March 5th, Ndongo would be arrested for supposed plots of treason against him. There was a coup attempt, real or imagined, that resulted in Macias arresting a third of his own government. It was a massive, open, and very bloody purge. Ndongo was given a Russian goodbye and tossed out of a window of the presidential palace after his legs were broken with rifle butts. He was denied medical attention, dying in agony a few days later. Macias took a moment to take several photographs of the dying man while he lay on the street, keeping them in a photo album on his nightstand. This next part I am going to quote directly. Dozens of the country's leaders, both from the government and opposition, were detained and killed. Pastor Torao Sikara died of thirst in Bata jail. The scholar Bubi, cabinet chief in the foreign ministry, Enrique Gori Molubuela, died of gangrene after his eyes had been gouged out. The Fernandinos were the Creoles, mayor of Santa Isabel, Anando Nunez Balboa Dugan, died in prison under unknown circumstances. The country's incumbent Minister of Justice, Ewaro Ndongo, was placed under house arrest and later killed. Antonio Ewaro Obama, ex-president of the IPGE and Assemblea candidate, disappeared without a trace. Former Minister of Agriculture from the colonial era, Rafael Nsu Nchama, was murdered along with his successor, Inve Ondo Nchama. Although Macias stated that only about 10 people had been arrested, at least 18 prisoners died of gangrene after their legs had been broken. This was the report from Bata Hospital alone. Many old scores were settled in the prisons and the streets. Sidney Dunn, the British consul in Santa Isabel, reported virtual anarchy in a message on March 6th. Equatorial Guineans looked on while their fledgling democracy died brutally after a life of only 145 days. With all true political rivals dead and the Spaniards freaking out, Macias was free to do basically whatever the fuck he wanted. He took over the post of foreign minister directly and offered to be kind to any whites who decided to stay, but this turned out to be not very enticing after he had just murdered like 100 people. And by the end of April, 92% of whites had fled the country, along with a large number of Africans as well. They were the smart ones. But they took with them technical and managerial skills that crippled the country completely. All of those pre-independence strengths that I mentioned, immediately gone. And believe it or not, it's only gonna get worse. But despite this whole shit show, Spain actually doubled down on its economic partnership and exploitation of the country, and their partnerships with Macias, by signing a trade agreement that was essentially mercantilist in nature and also extended aid towards the country's budget and helped replace many of the technical experts that had fled. The sudden fallout of the mass exodus had been alleviated, and business was beginning to churn again. The country would be admitted to the United Nations and the IMF, actually bringing it to the world stage. It seemed that Macias had just done that silly little thing new dictators tend to do, and was still planning to be a good little Spanish toy that planned to integrate into the world economy. But you didn't click on this video for a morally gray character, did ya? This was just a brief lull, because Macias was insane. Once he ran out of enemies to purge, he started inventing them. The constitution that had been established with Spanish help, gone. In the aftermath of the March incident, all political parties were banned, and in July of 1970, a new party, the United National Workers' Party, or PUNT, was established. The Youth on the March with Macias, or JMM, would also be established. This was a paramilitary organization that recruited people as old as 30 and as young as 7. Jesus fucking Christ, we are 5 months in and he's already using child soldiers, and this group would essentially be his brown shirts. They existed to beat up and harass anyone deemed a threat to the state. On May 7th of 1971, the Council of State and the Legislative Assembly were both effectively abolished, and Macias began to rule by personal decree. He granted himself complete legislative, ministerial, and judicial powers, effectively making himself the state in its entirety. In October, Law No. 1 was introduced, which established the death penalty for either conspiring against Macias, threatening Macias, or slandering Macias in any way. That last one technically was only 12 years of prison time, but let's be real, prison was just a longer execution by torture and deprivation. All levels of the civil service would have mandated political police presence to ensure compliance. By the end of that year, all citizens of the country were required by law to be members of PUNT, and were made members at birth. In July of 1972, any lingering political organizations were forcibly merged into PUNT, and Macias declared himself president for life, along with Major General of the National Armed Forces and Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture. Whatever that means. With literally nothing to stop his madness, the blood would flow in abundance. Okay, deep breath. Here we fucking go. Macias would declare, quote, "These so-called intellectuals are the greatest problem facing Africa today. They are polluting our climate with foreign culture." And so he declared a great crusade to rid Equatorial Guinea of subversive elements, and started having them all killed. The JMM was given free rein to destroy those declared enemies of the state, and they did so, rounding up teachers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, educated tribal leaders, those who had received higher education in Spain, and others deemed intellectual. Sometimes even just wearing glasses or talking too well would get you declared an intellectual and hauled off. They were either slaughtered outright in public mass executions in village squares or tossed into overcrowded prisons replete with torture and violence. Sometimes victims were hanged, other times shot on live television. Some were beaten with clubs and others were buried alive. Those who managed to flee the country were hunted down, as Punt and its secret police maintained branches in other countries. Not only would these people be killed, but their loved ones would be rounded up and massacred, and in some instances entire villages of people would be cut to pieces for having these intellectuals in their midst. One such specific instance occurred on Christmas Eve of 1969, when 186 prisoners were marched into Malabo Football Stadium and murdered while Mary Hopkins's cover of Those Were the Days played on the loudspeakers. It was Macias's favorite song. 36 of the prisoners were buried up to their necks and had their heads eaten by fire ants over the course of several days. Conditions in the prisons like Black Beach and Bata were horrendous. In fact, those who were executed were perhaps the lucky ones. Prisoners were subjected to the most horrific torture imaginable daily, a particular favorite of their jailers being hanging prisoners upside down and whipping them savagely until they fell unconscious. They were denied food and water, and the blistering Central African heat made the cramped and unfurnished cells absolutely nightmarish. Thousands of inmates were crammed into prisons designed for a few dozen people. Executions were frequently conducted by simply smashing the victim's head in with an iron bar, with other inmates forced to clean up their fallen comrades' viscera and brain matter. Oftentimes, when a suspected dissident was arrested, their entire families would be arrested along with them. Female prisoners were frequently raped and had their genitals mutilated, and if they had husbands, this would be done in front of them. Another common torture method was to simply leave the prisoners tied up in such a position that they would be set upon by mosquitoes and other insects, and there are accounts of some prison guards and wardens practicing cannibalism. It is said that Macias himself enjoyed watching the torture personally. Not convinced at the effectiveness of the National Guard and JMM, he also established a political police force, the Popular Militia, which was primarily tasked with killing members of the other two organizations. This was followed by a purge of the Fang elders and the destruction of their tribal traditions, with Macias making sure that these leaders were replaced with young members of organizations loyal to him to build an ironclad support network. He also began a campaign against his last major focal point of opposition, the Catholic Church. He would effectively renounce his Catholic faith in favor of traditional Fang cults, while simultaneously claiming to be an atheist. Remember, mentally unstable, just roll with it. This came with a few quirks. He began collecting skulls, for one, believing them to possess divine power, and he surrounded himself with declared sorcerers and traditional dancers, which doubled as methods of spreading his influence to the countryside. By embracing this traditional faith, the Fang people began to see him as a godlike figure. He would take this to heart, and may have genuinely begun to believe that he possessed some divine power, referring to himself as the unique miracle. Propaganda began to declare that God created Equatorial Guinea thanks to Macias, and without Macias, Equatorial Guinea would not exist. These statements were required to be integrated into all Catholic religious ceremonies, and any priest who refused such profanity was killed. In effect, the unique miracle had declared himself to be a god. In 1973, Christian names were banned, Christian ceremonies were banned, and the church was forbidden from collecting tithes or offerings, effectively making it dependent on the state. Church education was also banned, and private schools were closed and demolished. Later in the decade, even associating with Christian churches was grounds for arrest, and the JMM would go house to house searching for birth certificates and looking for any Christian iconography, arresting those found with anything on hand. Finally, in June of 1978, the Catholic Church and all Christian denominations would be outlawed, and the final 6 remaining Catholic priests in the country, most of them in their 60s, would be imprisoned and literally ransomed back to the Spanish Catholic Church. There was to be only one god in Equatorial Guinea, and that god was Macias. In July of 1973, a new constitution was enforced, which formalized Macias's total control over all aspects of society and also gave him control over foreign affairs. A referendum was held on this constitution. If you voted against its adoption or abstained from voting, you were killed. As a part of this, in November of 1973, the island of Fernando Po was renamed Macías Nguema Biogo Island, because why the fuck not? His ego had gotten downright planetary in scale by this point, if you couldn't tell. Closing down the Catholic schools and killing, exiling, or imprisoning most of the country's teachers meant that literacy in the country collapsed completely. Macias was now at the center of all education, and teachers were replaced with punt officials who existed simply to indoctrinate the youth. And if you, a parent, complained about your child not not being educated, you better believe that was an express ticket to a concentration camp. Institutes of higher education were built with Spanish help, but few of them ever operated for any sizable length of time. And in 1972, when it was found that students were writing anti-Macias slogans on blackboards and destroying his portraits, the Minister of Education was executed in the street for all to see, and many students spent time in prisons. By 1973, even using the word intellectual was punishable by jail time. One individual in particular, Manuel Castillo González Barril, who was responsible for significant literature on Fang language and philosophy, would be beaten to death in 1974 and have his head cut open, his brain being eaten by those present. And then, in late 1975, Macias effectively abolished the concept of education completely by closing down all schools. Satisfied that education in his country had been completely destroyed, Macias then turned to his people's health. Modern medical practice was effectively banned in favor of pseudoscience and folk healing. He placed all medical drugs and equipment in the entire country under his own personal control, giving him complete authority over life and death. Hospitals and clinics were left to rot after their entire staffs were replaced with punt goons and secret police officers who had zero medical knowledge. The result was repeated disease outbreaks. In 1973, the island of Annobon saw half its entire population die in a cholera outbreak after Macias locked up all the vaccines issued by the World Health Organization. By 1976, the very practice of medicine had functionally ceased to exist within the country, and hundreds would die every month from preventable causes. Furthermore, as a part of his campaigns against intellectuals, the act of wearing glasses was banned. In June of 1974, an alleged coup attempt broke out and was crushed inside Bata prison, with 118 prisoners being killed. This was used as a pretext to round up and kill hundreds more for alleged cooperation with the coup, which included dozens of members of the clergy and a 16-year-old boy, who had his legs broken before he was shot. The church's alleged involvement with this probably fake coup attempt resulted in all religious meetings being banned, and many churches were taken over and used for other purposes. Anti-Macias resistance groups would also emerge amongst the refugee community, but Macias was able to infiltrate and destroy many of them with his agents, and save for a few small cross-border incursions and skirmishes, resistance was limited in scale. Anyone caught with ties to these groups was put to death. This seems like a perfect time to also destroy the economy, because why not? First and foremost, after the National Bank ran out of money, it was closed, and its director was tortured to death behind a hotel. Next, remember those Nigerian contract laborers that were essential for Fernando Po's agriculture industry? Well, Macias started brutalizing them and treating them like slaves, and in 1970 and 71, at least 95 of them would be straight up killed. Killing foreign nationals is usually a bad idea for diplomacy, so in 1974, the labor treaty was not renewed, and then the JMM attacked a bunch of Nigerian embassy staff. As such, all of the Nigerians went home, and those who didn't, and the wives of the workers who weren't allowed to follow them to Nigeria, were all killed. This risked destroying what was left of the country's economy, since the coffee and cocoa risked going unharvested. So Macias decided to fix this by simply instituting actual slavery on the plantations. When the people of the country refused orders for mandatory labor service to the state, Macias sent his thugs to go literally kidnap 40,000 people to shove them onto plantations, where they worked 12-hour days for no pay and regular beatings. This was exacerbated by the fact that the last Spanish businesses pulled out due to the sheer incompetence of Macias's government, although Spain would continue to finagle whatever little influence over the country it still could, directly ignoring all of the state's excesses in the name of cheap coffee. As a final desperate measure, Macias nationalized the entire economy, placing all businesses and farms under direct state control and banning private trade in any form. The people left that took charge of everything were incompetent and unskilled, and by 1976, production and exports of basically everything had fallen to near zero. Macias also killed the entire fishing industry overnight by destroying all boats in the country, due to the thousands of people fleeing Fernando Po, effectively turning the island into a massive concentration camp. He also banned anyone from setting foot on the island's beaches, which killed what tiny amount of tourism may have remained. But of course, Macias believed that the economy was just fine, and any belief to the contrary was treason. When the director of statistics presented him with a report that the economy was in fact collapsing, Macias had him dismembered to, quote, help him learn to count. This was capped off with hyperinflation. The lack of foreign trade meant that there was basically no foreign currency in the country, so when a new currency was introduced in 1975, its value collapsed immediately. The only people who could be paid were secret police members and punt officials, and the rest of the country was effectively reduced to that of a barter economy. Speaking of Spain, their influence would gradually wane as there simply was nothing left to influence, and they grew increasingly annoyed with Macias constantly bitching at them to send him money and more technical aid that never seemed to do anything. This culminated in 1976 when Spain formally severed ties with the regime, effectively ending their partnership. Despite this, Macias continued to maintain an international presence. In fact, his actions were outright overlooked by the international community. France, the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba would all maintain varying levels of outright cooperation with Macias's regime. The Soviets and Cuba in particular propped up his regime through trade and military support, and Soviet ships would be stationed in Equatorial Guinea for several years. The Western world effectively ignored the pleas of the massive Equatorial Guinean refugee community, either because they directly benefited from Macias's limited exports or simply did not care about the small country of little geopolitical relevance. One of his closest allies was actually North Korea, and he considered himself a close personal friend of Kim Il-sung. He would even send his children to North Korea to be educated, and after he was overthrown, his kids would be taken in by Kim Il-sung and raised in the country. The country's African regional neighbors also maintained normal relations with Macias for the most part, and Jean Bedel Bokassa's Central Africa and Idi Amin's Uganda even operated as close allies. Throughout his reign, various international organizations like the WHO and UNESCO would go through the country as well, attempting to establish something resembling functional health and education networks, but these were crushed by suspicion from Macias, believing absolutely all of them to be Western spies in some form. Many aid volunteers found themselves arrested or expelled, hindering aid efforts almost completely. By 1978, the common people of Equatorial Guinea had been reduced to hunting and gathering to survive. Access to food was limited. Meat and dairy products were essentially non-existent, and what products could be acquired were expensive due to inflation and import costs. All of the country's livestock had been slaughtered, and most of its coffee and cocoa trees had been cut down for firewood, the people trying desperately to survive in the most horrific conditions imaginable. Dozens of towns and villages were completely uninhabited, and several had been razed to the ground in their entirety. The largest cities, including the capital Malabo, were functionally ghost towns. Few dared to venture outside for any reason other than abject necessity. Nobody had medicine, and even something as simple as soap was an impossible luxury. Trade on the individual level had all but collapsed, leaving even those who could produce something desperately impoverished. Tens of thousands had fled, and in some instances entire villages of people would escape into Gabon, taking anything they had left with them. In response to the refugee problem, Macias had the only road leading out of the country littered with landmines, forcing those who remained to make an impossible choice between complete poverty and starvation, or risking their legs being blown off and being brutalized by Macias's forces for the crime of trying to flee. Equatorial Guinea had suffered arguably the worst societal and economic collapse in modern history, rivaling even that of Pol Pot's Cambodia. International observers had dubbed the country the Dachau of Africa, a title befitting that of the world's largest prison camp. Of course, though, there was plenty of money and resources to be spent on Macias and his goons. They were living large. He walled off a huge chunk of the capital, bought himself a private jet, overhauled the port of Bata despite the fact that nobody used it, and spent a shitload of money on weapons for his minions. Hotels were kept open, and the streets of Malabo and Bata were swept and maintained aggressively to keep up the facade of normalcy. He had a $12 million presidential palace constructed in Bata, and he went on international trips every year to visit high-class Spanish and Swiss medical facilities. He had over a dozen mistresses whom he treated to extravagant dinners and events, but because he was jealous to the end, he would have their husbands murdered. Treviano also enriched himself greatly through trade monopolies disguised as economic development missions, and those who were closest and most loyal to Macias were practically drowning in wealth. Punt officials had access to designer brands from across the world, and all the alcohol they could drink, paid for in literal wads of cash that they threw out without a care in the world. So they were doing just fine. While all of this was happening, Macias descended into nothing short of complete, unfiltered insanity. He suffered from horrific nightmares that only worsened with his brutality, and he began to hallucinate his victims with increasing frequency. Ondo Idu and Ndongo Mions stalked the corners of his vision. There was a story of him ordering a dinner table set for 8 people, only for him to sit down, alone, and talk to the empty seats for several hours. His speeches became slurred, incoherent, and rambling, throwing insults and threats at enemies that didn't exist. And yet, he was ever more convinced of his own divine power, even when his belief in that divine power led him to order power plants to stop using lubricating oil, plunging his country into total darkness. His madness had taken such an intense toll on the country that by 1978, the snake was beginning to devour its own tail. He could blame Western imperialist and capitalist powers all he wanted, but he just kept finding enemies. Every day, Macias was convinced of a new coup attempt. Every day, more blood would be shed, dozens of innocent people dumped in mass graves for crimes they had never even thought of committing. The truth of the matter is, Macias was running out of people to kill. These daily purges increasingly targeted his own security forces and government. Vice President Bossio would be executed in 1975, having made it impressively long for a Bubi nationalist, and with that he essentially had no ministers left, as the average lifespan for a member of Macias's government could be measured in weeks. Much of his government was now made up of security personnel and personal family members, many of whom had gone mad themselves. Macias was alone in his own little world, cut off from his country by the 10-foot-tall walls and concrete bunkers of his compound near his hometown. The only thing he had truly succeeded at was stomping out hope and breaking the will of his people so thoroughly that most believed that this state of affairs would continue forever. But even the most loyal were beginning to realize the true disaster that Macias had inflicted upon their homeland. They lived large in their palaces and bunkers, but they ruled over a kingdom of bones and ash. Every year, the government became more and more non-functional, as the constant purges meant that useless idiots had taken over basically all positions of relevance. Much of the local governance had fallen into the hands of psychopaths who were busy being corrupt and terrorizing the people who remained to be terrorized. Most high-ranking positions were staffed with Macias's cousins, nephews, and other family members, although most of these positions were functionally irrelevant anyway. And as his relations with Spain collapsed, and the last Spaniards in the country left, the sheer scale of the ruination wrought by the regime began to fully set in. While expatriate resistance against Macias was weak and disorganized, it was still something that lingered in everyone's mind. And no matter how many people he had shot or beaten to death, the problems never went away. In late 1976, 100 members of the government were executed for having the audacity to present a petition to Macias asking him to stop his absolutely disastrous economic policies, leaving what remained of the state apparatus completely rudderless. Even Treviano had fallen out of favor by this point, being forced to flee the country. Dissent was building, even amongst his own family, but Macias still had further to fall before they would be compelled to act. In 1978, the international community began to finally wake up to the realities of the Macias regime, after a report by Swedish anthropologist Robert Klintberg was brought to the United Nations Human Rights Council, which finally got them off of their asses, leading to a condemnation and sanctions against Macias. Thanks, UN. Useful as fucking always, I see. Only took you 9 fucking years. Condemnations flooded in from the European community and Amnesty International, which claimed that 1 in every 500 Equatorial Guineans had been executed by the regime. This number proved to be lowballing it. European aid programs were suspended. The Organization of African Unity finally condemned him as well, and allegations of child marriages, slave trading, and other atrocities began to permeate international circles. The country's UN ambassador attempted damage control, sticking to his classic line that no human rights abuses existed in Equatorial Guinea, and that Klintberg was conspiring with terrorists to overthrow the government, but the stand had been made. And suddenly, the wealth and power of the government began to wane, and this had the effect of isolating Macias further. And to the very end of his pathetic and horrific life, Macias was a devil, and by 1979, he had begun to lash out at even his own family members. One of these was his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, one of the few people who was in charge of the country's military. He was Macias's de facto right-hand man, and the ruler of Fernando Po. He ruled with a fist of iron and lived as lavishly as his uncle, and he signed off on many, many lives personally in the name of propping up the regime. But in 1979, even he was beginning to have doubts. Doubts which were brutally confirmed in June of that year, when his brother was murdered by Macias's thugs after having the audacity to complain about 8 months of missed pay. Macias had made the fatal error of many a tyrant. He had put even his loyalists at risk. And when this happened, they acted out of desperation. The cousins and nephews of Macias gathered in Bata and came to the conclusion that he had to go, or else all of them were probably going to die. The little coalition that was established was made up primarily of his family members, since they were basically all that was left, but quickly expanded to include basically everyone else of note that remained in the country, from military officers to remaining Bubi and Fernandino figures. The coup also received quiet support from Spain, which had seen its monarchy restored, and several other foreign governments, who were interested to see where it would go. There were genuinely so few, but those few were enough. On August 3rd of 1979, Macias was overthrown. Fernando Po and Bata were seized in a short but bloody brawl, seeing the vast majority of Macias's loyalists throw down their arms. The coup was quickly recognized by the Spanish government, which promised as much financial, humanitarian, and military aid as was required to put the broken nation back together, a promise that was followed by Gabon, and Cameroon. However, Macias was able to flee to his fortress near Mongomo with a few hundred die-hard loyalists, and a bloody conflict ensued. Supported by his Cuban bodyguard and North Korean officers, an attempt was made to retake Bata, but this failed after hundreds of casualties, and Macias's forces were decimated by desertion once they learned that it was their countrymen overthrowing him. After a brutal siege of Macias's fortress and several hundred dead, the coup was over. Macias fled into the jungle, but not before one final act of impossible cruelty, burning upwards of $100 million worth of the country's remaining cash reserves. He was caught on August 18th, apparently completely delirious with suitcases full of money stuffing his car. The unique miracle had been reduced to a groveling, shattered mess. On August 9th, Obiang held a press conference where he declared an end to the regime of terror and that the country would be ruled by a military council for a transitional period. Thousands of political prisoners were released, but not before a few hundred more were shot for good measure, and he practically begged the international community to invest in the country to help put the pieces back together. The country was rocked by literal celebrations in the street. You might think that the ending of the recut of Return of the Jedi is unreasonable, but that shit literally happened. I assure you there was a Gungan in Malabo somewhere chanting, "Wisa free," or something like that. Foreign journalists flooded the country to be greeted by cheering crowds. The Catholic Church was unbanned, and priests returned from abroad to baptize literally hundreds of people in days. Curfews were lifted, restrictions on travel were ended, everyone's back pay was given out, Macias had his name stripped from Fernando Po, and his likeness and references to him were scrubbed from every building in every town. Spanish aid and advisors flooded the country, and aid from Europe and Africa would flow unabated by the end of August. The people could finally awake from their decade-long national nightmare to feel something resembling hope for the first time in a long, long time. As for Macias, the decision was made to put him on trial, which was difficult because he had destroyed the country's legal system and educated class so thoroughly that no court system actually existed, and no lawyers were around to have a trial. But they had one anyway. On September 24th, Francisco Macias Nguema was put before a military tribunal in Malabo, in a courtroom carved out of a movie theater due to the lack of facilities. It was a reasonably proper trial. Procedure was followed, and Macias was even allowed to have a defense counsel. Careful effort was undertaken to absolve the new government of their very well-known role in the previous regime, especially after Macias started pointing out the fact that the coup had been carried out by a person who was essentially his chief executioner. As such, he was only charged with 101 murders rather than the genocide that was initially thrown at him, and he was also charged with crimes against humanity, corruption, embezzlement, and everything else under the sun. Macias and a mere 6 others were sentenced to death. He himself was disturbingly calm. He threatened his captors that his ghost would haunt them in the afterlife, and refused all food and drink leading up to his death. The evening of September 29th, Macias was taken out into the yard of Black Beach Prison and shot. He was 55 years old. It was perhaps a far more dignified death than he deserved. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in a forest near Malabo. It is impossible to describe the state that Macias had left Equatorial Guinea when he bled to death in that courtyard. All industry and agriculture was gone. Poverty reigned. A per capita income of $1,400 a year in 1968 had fallen to a mere $70 a year. Infant mortality had jumped to 60%, and life expectancy bottomed out to less than 30 years. Exact numbers for those impacted by the regime are inconsistent and not fully known because Macias's government did not keep statistics. But to give rough estimates, based on a pre-Macias population of about 300,000, between 70,000 and 100,000 people fled the country. Of those that remained, between 20,000 and 80,000 people were murdered by the regime. If we take the absolute high ends of those numbers, Macias oversaw a population decline of nearly 60%. Over half the entire population of the country had been arrested or imprisoned at least once. The Bubi people suffered particularly hard, their population being cut in half, with a huge diaspora being created in the process. The country suffered from such horrendous brain drain due to the slaughter of intellectuals that it has literally yet to recover. There is no historical nuance for Macias. He was evil, and inflicted such inhuman suffering on the people of Equatorial Guinea that he is simply undeserving of it. As for the country itself, it would recover, but very, very slowly, and never fully. Obiang would become the country's next president, and he continues to rule to this day as de facto dictator. And I mean it, bro is winning these elections with like 99% of the vote every time. You can call it African dictator numbers because he is the fucking standard upon which other African dictators' numbers are measured. That said, I won't say too much about him because because apparently he has a tendency to sue, and I would prefer to not have to deal with that. The country isn't a true democracy, and the people lack most civil rights and liberties, especially freedom of speech. Since the new ruling class was essentially the same as the old one, but minus the clinically insane person at the helm, the country still suffers from extreme corruption and authoritarian excesses. Oil was discovered in 1995, but all this did was make the ruling clique richer and make the already unequal economic situation of the country even less so. It is also still very low on the Human Development Index, suffering from high poverty rates, especially in Rio Muni, and a lack of services to large parts of the population. And of course, the country still suffers from human rights violations as common practice. That said, it is still a marked improvement over the reign of Macias, which is definitely a sobering thought. When you are at rock bottom, there is literally nowhere to go but up, I suppose. In the same way that merely being trapped in hell is a marked improvement over also being stuck in the ball-crushing machine for 1,000 years. Hopefully, Equatorial Guinea can eventually return to the potential it had before the rise of Macias. The people deserve something to look forward to after all they've been through. Right, well, that was just a fucking ray of sunshine to end on. You thought this one got a good ending? Lol. Lamau, even. Real life can be impossibly cruel sometimes. Anyways, I now somehow need to transition this into a Patreon plug. Big shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. You all help prop up my dictatorship and turned a blind eye to my crimes. Don't take that seriously. Extra special thanks goes to Ukrainian Shadow Government, Charles Jalak, Peter Bardos, Ministry of Autismus Affairs, Wolf Commissar, Jonathan Hernandez, Cheese122, A Normal Cow 5, Black Mare, Andrew Deffenbach, Jay, Ray Nertz, Ouch That Hurt, Seor, Harper's Ferry Blues, Ziam Z, Greek Nationalist, The Flag and Anthem Guy, Price, The Oil Master, Gangdolf Bangdolf, Kim, Codename Titan Zebra, Billiam Bones, CT Oldsmobile, Clever Riley 9, Comrade Cosmo, WLF 251, Jimmy Legs, A Dog with Sunglasses, Snow Cone Squad, Newt Schmidt, Anthony, 23 Tavarm, Nick Fontaine, Aiden, Higgs, Yours truly Shin, The Shakiest Gun in the Ozarks, Waffles 1811, Khrushchev's Favorite Cornstalk, Derek, Dr. Mr. Medic, and Carl Arty. If you too would like to support the unique miracle that is the Spartan 761 channel, consider joining my Patreon. Tiers 2 and 3 get access to the Spartan Journal, extra content every month. And on that note, that about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.